if architecture could cool our planet instead of warming it? In this episode today, I'm joined by award-winning architect Joe MacDonald, founder of Urban A&O, whose groundbreaking work is reshaping everything from carbon-neutral data centers to smart city and zero-waste eco-resorts. From Beijing to Mykonos or New York, where he lives, he's designing the future, and today we dive with him into what that looks like. So Joe, a very warm welcome to the Shades of Life Impact Podcast.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
So glad to have you today on one of my favorite topics, and we haven't covered it on the podcast yet. So a generic question to start with, and then we will talk about your journey and what you do. If we have an overview first, we know that the building and construction sector where you operate accounts for nearly 40% of global CO2 emissions, more than any other industry when you consider both the energy we use to power buildings and the carbon embedded in the materials themselves. So in a world racing to cut emissions, that's a staggering figure. So do you believe this is a sector where we can move fast enough? And what would it take to turn this massive footprint into a climate solution, if we look at it with a bird's eye view to start with?
Well, I think if we look at it holistically and we look at it from a global point of view, your statistics are absolutely correct. There's one component of our work, which isn't a very glamorous component, that is to salvage existing buildings. And in order to do that, for example, here in New York City, in the financial district, we decarbonize buildings. So we take existing building stock, we do an energy audit on the building, we evaluate the internal mechanical systems, and then we swap them out. And it's called decarbonization and electrification. And therefore, we're able to repurpose existing buildings without building new. But when we build new, that's a whole different story. I'll get into that if you like.
Yeah, there are two sides to the picture. Very interesting. So before we dive deeper into the big picture solutions, the ones you bring to the table today, I'd love to step back with you and ask about your own journey. What first drew you to architecture as a profession? Was there a moment or influence that made you feel this is the path I want to take?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm often asked this question, and I knew I wanted to be an architect ever since I was a little boy. I was always building cardboard homes in the basement for my parents, and I was always thinking spatial design. So I think people have this misnomer that to be an architect, you have to be very good at math and sciences. And in my experience, to be a good architect requires real ingenuity and creativity. And so I exhibited those features when I was a little.
Okay, so creativity would come first, you would say?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, we can certainly see it in your work today, that's for sure. And we will share pictures of it as part of a podcast for YouTube. So, Joe, today your firm, Urban A&O, is known as a global boutique architecture firm, leading the way in innovative, sustainable design. So I'm curious, was sustainability part of a vision from day one, or was there a pivotal moment that shifted your focus towards climate-conscious architecture?
Yeah, it was interesting. So Urban A&O, I launched Urban A&O when I was on faculty at Harvard, and the endeavor there was schools were looking at computational design software at that time. Which tools would grad schools use? And so I had the opportunity. I was designing an exhibit for Ford Motor Company. So I had the opportunity to travel to Dearborn, Michigan, where I saw them making cars. And of course, cars are often full-scale modeled out of clay. But at the same time, there was a room with with computers in it. And so there were all these computational designers who were modeling the vehicles, the shell of the vehicles, and they were using a software called CATIA, which is a very advanced tool by Dassault Systems out of Paris. And so when I was on faculty at Harvard, the chair and I invited the president of Dassault Systems over for a visit. And I asked him for 24 workstations in order to teach this studio at Harvard, and he gave them to us. So our early work, and this is still visible to this day, is based on complex curving geometries. So, but there was always a biophilic inspiration to our work. So I was looking at the work of Ernst Haeckel, a famous biologist. So looking at the patterns found in leaves and coral and seashells and things like that. So there's always been, even with computational design, it was always inspired by forms and patterns found in nature.
Wonderful. I love that.
And to answer the second half of your question, I then moved over to the University of Pennsylvania. And that's where, at this time, the world started to talk about the drive to net zero and what that meant in the financial sectors, what that meant in architecture, and what that meant for the planet. So this drive to net zero became something very important to me personally and within our firm. And we were one of the first firms to really take a deep dive into what that actually means when we build new. And so, for example, we have a tool in the office called the carbon triangle. And it's shaped like a triangle, and it rates building materials on their GWP, global warming potential. So, of course, steel is at the top, and then there's zero, which means zero carbon intensity. And then, believe it or not, there are materials below zero, which are carbon sequestering materials. And that would include things like CLT, cross-laminated timber, CL, cross-laminated bamboo, algae, and other kind of cutting edge materials that people are starting to use now. So it is possible to build architecture that is carbon sequestering at this point.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's great to discover this through your work and what materials you use. So yeah, I love inspiration from nature and then also being climate conscious. That's two aspects that are really, really nice. I have an uncle actually who worked for Dassault all his life as an engineer. So it's nice to see the link here.
Wonderful.
So, Joe, to explain this to people as well, when we talk about the building and construction sector contributing nearly 40% of global emissions, it's actually a mix of two sources. I think it's around 20% from what's called operational carbon and about 13% from embodied carbon. So, as a specialist and an expert today, can you walk us through the difference between these two, because it matters, and why they both matter when we think about designing for a sustainable future?
Yes. So when we build a building, that is called embodied carbon. And that means that the materials that we are choosing to build the building, that is itself gives off GHG emissions. Now, when we talk about the lifespan of the building, that's operational carbon. That means the GHG emissions from the operational building throughout its lifetime. Now, where we're able to step in as architects is in the embodied carbon space. So, for example, Urban A&O, we're constantly on the lookout for emerging material science. It's one of our tenets of our firm. So we have partnered with Boston Metal, for example, which is a green steel that came out of Professor Don Sadoway's lab. We also partner with a company called Solidia, which is a very low carbon concrete. Now, one of the greatest offenders of GHG emissions is concrete. So we should really emphasize that around the world, and this is true both in the global north, but predominantly in the global south, a building out of CMU, concrete masonry units, it's very inexpensive, but it's also using Portland cement. So if we were to identify the offender in concrete, it's the Portland cement that is the offender. So if we're able to remove Portland cement from concrete, Portland cement is the binder that holds concrete together. But if we can find an organic binder, and we have, then, uh, for example, Solidia, it is 70% less GHG emissions, 90% less water usage, and it's 30% um, uh, uh, less curing time, which is fantastic because usually it takes 28 days for concrete to cure. Solidia will cure in 24 hours. So that's a really impressive statistic.
Yeah,
And that actually came out of Princeton University, and it's commercialized. Both Boston Metal and Solidia have commercialized. That commercialization is a very important thing because that means that it is now available for use by the building industry.
Do you actually say concrete or cement, or is it the same thing?
Well, when we say concrete, that would be, for example, concrete floors, columns, walls. But it's the cement that has the Portland cement in it. So when we
Okay.
refer to cement, we're actually talking about the Portland cement in the concrete.
So let's stay with this topic because the statistics I've seen is that cement alone is responsible for roughly 8% of global CO2 emissions. I've actually seen a recent figure saying 12%, so I don't know. Sometimes it's difficult to measure it. But basically, it is more than the entire aviation industry. If we measure CO2 emissions, it's very comparable to the fashion industry as well. So that's again a staggering number for something so foundational to how we build today, especially in our Western countries. So why is cement so carbon intensive? If you can explain this to us. And are there real alternatives emerging that can help us build differently without compromising on strength or scale? I think you mentioned price as well, perhaps.
Right. So I'm glad that you compared cement to two of the worst offenders, which one is fashion and the other is aviation fuel. Of course, there have been great strides in SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, using fuels, which is so that's wonderful. Fashion is a huge problem because I believe 70% of production. You've heard the term fast fashion, of course. And so what happens there is they overproduce, and then that stock that doesn't get sold goes to the landfills. So there's a whole industry, and there's a whole bunch of heroes in the fashion industry. I'm not one of them, but there are many who are trying to solve that problem. But as far as cement, we've touched on it briefly a little bit. That is where we have to get the Portland cement out the mix. Now, we may be able to achieve that in the developed world, but it's very difficult to achieve that in the global south, for example. So when I talk about companies that have commercialized, I'm also talking about companies that need to scale their product. So back to Solidia, for example, I, it that product, if we could get products like that to scale globally and affordably, you're right about that. Is there an upcharge to Solidia? Well, there isn't. All products in the US have to go through ASTM standards, and they have done so. I have a colleague out that I'm working with on the festival trails for the Los Angeles Olympics and the World Cup, and he has developed hemp cement, hemp concrete,
Really? Oh, that's
which
amazing.
is incredible. There's hemp block, there's hemp brick. We did a 1,000 square foot home recently in Texas, and we used hemp brick, and we were able to get the carbon intensity below zero. So it's a carbon sequestering facade. And of course that's a very large home. So that made an impact. But back to the global south. It's if we're able to, and it's interesting, we have a relationship with a group out of Bangladesh. And we are trying to bring these kinds of products to that region of the world. And we are also, as you mentioned, we're smart city master planners. We're doing a project in Africa, a smart city master plan, and we will bring these principles to them as well. Now, working in these for Western architects to work in continents like Africa, of course, we have to do so observing local customs and making sure that we're also lifting local economies while we do that. So there's it's not a philanthropic mission, it's just good business sense that we're able to employ as many people on the ground as possible when we do this. But again, back to your question about cement is we're bringing this technology with us to Africa.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. So we are going to continue to talk about Africa a little bit because one thing I wanted to bring to the conversation, which matters when we talk about architecture, is that we are expecting over 2 billion new urban dwellers by 2050. We know the population is going to continue to grow. We are over 8 billion today, forecasted to be at least 10 billion by 2050. And this especially across Asia and Africa. So that's a staggering wave of construction probably on the horizon. And at the same time, we have millions of existing buildings. You said this in the beginning that urgently need retrofitting to meet climate goals. So how do you think the architecture and construction sectors can rise to meet both challenges if we look forward? Building smarter cities from the ground up while also transforming what already exists. It's quite a big challenge, isn't it?
It is. And what's interesting about Urban A&O is, yes, we're staffed globally, but we work around the world as well. So we'll shift the conversation into the latest territory, if you don't mind. So we've moved on from this idea of sustainability because the definition of sustainability is how do we move forward in a sustainable fashion? Well, what about reparations for what we have done in the past? So we have started to use the word regenerative. So how can we be regenerative architects? And I'll give you one example. I think this is a very good example. Building a 300 megawatt data center in the Philippines. We partner with an IT company, famous IT company out of India. We build the core and shell. It looks like a mountain. I'll send you the image of it.
Okay.
And it's, of course, it's covered in vegetation, so you don't really know that it's a data center. It's also a hiking trail and a park, and it's quite exciting. Building a 300 megawatt data center in the Philippines. When you talked about urban dwellers, the numbers of people moving to urban centers, what we also have to think about, and this is, believe it or not, this is related to architecture. We also have to talk about food security when we talk about these urban centers and the rise in population as well. We have to talk about food security. So on that particular project, let's say that data center costs $1 billion to build. Well, whoever the tenant is, let's say it's one of the hyperscalers, Microsoft, Meta, Apple, AWS, part of the negotiation is that they would give just an extra $100 million. And that would, with a partner based in Singapore, but is Filipino, that he would build vertical farms around that property. We know that vertical farming, by the way, that land is barren because they've been producing rice on that land for decades and generations. So the soil is of low quality. But if we're able to build these greenhouses, vertical farming produces 3.5 times the amount of produce that typical farming, in the ground farming. So he's able to mass produce food for Southeast Asia. And remember, we're in the global South now. So he's providing food security for the global South, which is a wonderful mission. So we have two things going on here. We have the rise of AI, which is the demand for data centers, which are often seen as, huge energy hogs. But at the same time, it is by a very large lake. So that's where it gets its water supply. And that lake also provides what's required for the vertical farms as well.
That sounds fantastic, yeah. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into your work with data centers because that's something that really stands out and so needed in today's world. I also want to mention, I love you took Asia as an example because there is a circle in Asia, I can't remember what it's called, but where 4 billion of the population lives today, and it's literally half of the world's population. Even more important to look at this region where half of the world's population lives. So, Joe, the building industry doesn't exist in isolation. It's like any other sector. It's tightly connected to other resource-heavy sectors like mining, deforestation, water use, and massive amounts of waste. So when we design and build, we are not just shaping cities, we are influencing entire supply chains and ecosystems, and it's important to have this bird's eye view as well. So how do you navigate those wider impacts in your practice? And what does truly sustainable architecture mean to you when we zoom out to look at the full system?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Ingrid. We don't think in the traditional way of building a building. We know that we're contributing to an existing system, for example, which you've very eloquently outlined. So when we say smart city master planning, we believe that what the definition of that is socially, environment, and fiscally responsible cities. So we know for a fact that we are plugging into an existing system, and we are stressing that existing system by adding more dwelling units or more occupants to the building, which adds to the waste stream. It adds to the electric demand. It adds to the water demand. And so if we were to think of our cities from a more systemic point of view, then there are clean technologies that we are heavily invested in, and I can talk about them now. So, for example, we're building a project, a mixed-use development in Arizona on the Colorado River. Always thinking about clean energy solutions. So what would that be? That would be powered by green hydrogen fuel cells, geothermal, solar, hydropump storage. And we can use all of these clean technologies that have a very low, if not negative, carbon footprint to power our infrastructure. I was in Tokyo a couple of months ago giving this talk at the United Nations University of Tokyo. So I posited the question that, our cities could soon be run on green hydrogen. And that is something that is really not that far off in the future. And it was very interesting. I was on a call today with a woman from Helsinki, and we were talking about all the different types of hydrogen and the pros and cons of different hydrogen. So there's blue hydrogen, there's turquoise hydrogen, there's green hydrogen. So I won't get into details on what they mean, but they all come at a certain price point. So of course things have to be affordable, in order for systems to work. But at the same time, we have to start taking responsibility for the impact that we're making on the planet. So whenever we build new, we try to touch down as lightly as possible on the planet. And that includes our interface with these existing infrastructural systems that you're talking about.
Okay, it's fascinating. I actually would love to do some research about hydrogen myself because, it's like new fuels and new materials and new energy. And yeah, it's something I'd love to research. So we have talked about some big challenges already, but the architecture sector is also one of the most powerful levers for change. And I think we see this in what you've told us already. It's a sector with huge potential for innovation through low carbon materials, passive design, circular systems, or regenerative approaches. And I love your image of the regenerative architect. So at Urban A&O, you are at the forefront of many of these shifts. So could you walk us more as a summary through some of the key areas where you and your team are pushing the boundaries and reimagining what architecture can be?
Yes, sure. So this is where the conversation of AI has to enter the equation. So we, of course, my team is fully versed in AI, and we like to call it the responsible use of AI. So, what do we mean by that? We mean that we use AI as a research tool, but we also use it to help us understand emerging trends, emerging material science, for example. So, when we think, I was at an actually, I was at an investor event a couple of weeks ago. I was the only person from the built environment there. And so we went around the table and it was asked, what do you envision for the world to be in 2050? And more importantly, what will your contribution be to the world in 2050? I found that to be a fascinating question because I think that all architects should ask themselves this question: what will your contribution be by 2050? And I think that if you are not thinking regeneratively and from a systemic point of view about the impact that you're making on the planet, then I believe that uh, those architects who are, and there are many, by the way, it's not just Urban A&O, there are many like-minded architects who are on this path. What I find very interesting is there is capital markets out there who also believe in this, and they're willing to fund these kinds of projects. And so they tend to operate, it's very interesting that we're having this conversation at this particular moment in time, because they tend to operate, above political administrations and above political borders and above geopolitical conflicts, for example. So if we can rise above all of the disparities that are happening at that level, then we're able to move the needle. Takes two things. It takes visionary designers and it takes capital to back those visionaries. And the two of them exist. And I find that very, very encouraging given the times that we currently are living in.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. That's good to hear from you. So let's talk more about you and your team. One thing that stands out about Urban and A&O is how regularly your team brings academic research into architectural practice. That's not for free something we often hear about in the fast-paced world of design and construction. So can you tell us how has it shaped the kinds of solutions you're able to deliver?
Yes, I would say that um, we're a research-based firm, and so if if that is academic, so be it. But we are a research-based firm, and we have deep ties to universities, for example, where these kinds of emerging materials are being explored and funded, and there are labs associated with these institutions worldwide, absolutely worldwide. Scandinavia, the EU, America, Asia, and it's that uh, it's that drive for innovation and in ingenuity that is really fascinating because um, it transcends the current construction industry in that, without a doubt, there are developers worldwide who are extremely responsible in the developments that they make, the buildings that they build, and I can rattle off a dozen in New York City, for example. So there are builders and there are developers who care deeply about the planet. And so I think together, it requires the developer, it requires the capital, it requires the architect, it requires the construction company. If everybody is aligned on the same mission, then that's how we really achieve really great things. So back to your question about academic research, we find that it's by doing deep research in the office. So we have the structure of the office is very simple. I'm the founder. There are a series of principals under me, and each have a distinct role in the office. For example, smart city master planning, innovation, R&D, health and wellness. So all of this contributes. They don't operate in silos. They operate together. And together they produce the end product. So it's a very collaborative environment.
Joe, your work uses tools like parametric modeling and digital fabrication to drive design innovation. So for people who have never heard of that type of tools, can you explain how these technologies help you push boundaries, whether in form, material, or sustainability, or something else?
Yes. So computational design and digital fabrication has been around for a while. The 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 benefit of it as it progresses, because it does progress, tools get refined and refined and refined. What we're able to do with these tools, we have to remember they're just tools. They're not they're not generators of creativity or intellectual, you know,
Yeah.
IP or anything. They're tools used by the designer. But what they do is they offer exacting precision when we're designing something. And what we find is we use an iterative process to design projects. So we're able to iterate, which means design. We use the word versioning. So we're able to iterate several versions of the same solution very, very quickly. And then through digital fabrication, we're able to work with full-scale prototypes of our project before they even make it into the field. And it's that internal experimentation that gives us kind of a cutting edge on materials that we use, but also the geometries that we are using. And also, when you move through to construction, the tolerances that are required for construction. So on one hand, we're a design firm, but on the other hand, we're also thinking constantly about how the building will be assembled, and what is the most expeditious way of assembling a building. So in many ways, we somehow sit somewhere between. On one hand, we're way over in the R&D sector, and yet on the other hand, it's quite practical. It's how do you actually put a building together? And I think general contractors, or they're called EPCs, the construction companies, they appreciate that.
Joe, your work is often so visually striking, sculptural, fluid, and deeply tied to the natural world. So what inspires your creativity when it comes to form? Are there particular patterns in nature, principles of biomimicry, or other architectural works or even experiences that shape how you design? You did tell us about creativity, something very important to you.
Yes, yes. I think that there's always been a biophilic driver in all of the work we do. So as founder, one of my roles is to set concept in motion. And I've always done that at the firm. It's that relationship between, we actually don't see a distinction between architecture and landscape. So we're very much engaged in this indoor-outdoor relationship. And we call it experiential architecture. So when we design a space, the tools we use allow us to design it volumetrically. So we're always thinking about it experientially. we never think about architecture in 2D. It's always in 3D, and oftentimes it's always in motion. So we're always thinking about what it's like to move through a space, and what is that organic environment? What does that feel like? And what moods does that elicit? And as we move into the health and wellness space, we're thinking about, so for example, we're doing a veterans village, for example, or we're doing a health and wellness space. We're deeply thinking about the user in those spaces, and are we contributing positively to their experience of the space, and can architecture actually heal? This is something new for us. The strategies have been with us for a long time, but when we redirect it towards this kind of mission of healing,
Yeah.
it's very profound for us.
Yeah, love that. Absolutely love that. So to expand on this, I actually wanted to ask you, I do know you design different types of architectures and buildings, but when someone steps into one of your spaces, whatever it is, what do you hope they feel? What do you hope they take away from the experience overall? Do you think about that?
Of course I do. Of course I do. You want the experience to be memorable. You want it to be engaging. And so you'll find that the majority of our projects are very tactile. The materials we choose are very tactile. The forms we make are very tactile to the touch. And then at the same time, we're moving deeper and deeper into the senses, the human senses. So what is the scent? What is it like when you bring vegetation indoors? Uh, is there soil involved? Because soil has a certain scent to it, or is it fragrant in some ways? Or what are the materials that you're using when we do interiors, for example? What is it like to run your hand along a wall, for example? So we are very acutely aware of kind of architecture as a mnemonic device. As you leave the space, what will you remember most about the space? And it's different from user to user, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I also loved when you said you consider architecture, what you build, as part of a landscape. It just seems the right approach, isn't it? Rather than looking at it in isolation.
Right.
Okay, so in this second section of the conversation, I'd like now for us to discuss some concrete examples of your work to show or tell people what's possible in sustainable architecture, because you and your team have been working and are working on absolutely beautiful projects, and you mentioned some here and there already. So you and your team at Urban A&O have tackled some truly forward-thinking, cutting-edge projects that show how design can rise to meet the environmental challenges of our time, beginning with data centers. I really wanted to start with this one with you. We know that data centers are the invisible backbone of our digital lives. We are all aware that our tech demands keep growing exponentially, from cloud storage to AI, blockchain, or connected devices, you name it. And as they grow, so does their environmental footprint and certainly energy demand. So these buildings usually pose major sustainability challenges, especially around energy use and cooling. So how did you first get involved in designing carbon neutral data centers? Because I think you worked on a number of projects now.
Yeah.
And what drew you to this very modern and complex challenge, perhaps?
Right, right. Well, it's interesting, for those of us in the data center space, we've seen a massive acceleration over the last few years because of AI. So data center providers are building them at a rapid scale, almost overbuilding in anticipation of the future of AI. So if you want to get into that game or stay in that game, and as we do, how do you do so responsibly? And so we are constantly on the lookout for ways to, for example, if we were to bring a data center close to a city center, for example, rather than out in an office park somewhere where what it looks like doesn't matter. We find that if you bring a data center into the community it serves, for example, like you can do it through modularity. It turns out that because um, we are using SMRs to power data centers, small modular nuclear reactors, and they're very safe and they're compartmentalized, which means that you can add SMRs if you want to add additional power to a data center. So if we're using clean energy to power the data center, we know that we're reducing the carbon footprint. Of course, their data centers are massive producers of heat. So what do we do with that waste heat? There's certain ways that you can do it within the data center itself. There's immersion cooling, for example, where you can reduce the rack size, therefore the data center gets smaller, or that waste heat can be used elsewhere. So we'll see it in Scandinavia, for example, where there's a real demand for district heating, which means heating of residential homes. So we have done that. The Helsinki hybrid is a very interesting project because it's wrapped with a greenhouse.
So could you take us through Project Energios near Reno, Nevada? What makes it stand out in the context of sustainable design, and what have you and your team been able to achieve with it?
Yeah, that was one of our first ones. So that one, the achievement there was, as I said, we do core and shell, which is, well, it's important because it has to do with what the building looks like on the outside. And so what we devised there were a series of precast panels that were either low carbon. We were building that on site and then erecting the panels just simply on a steel frame. And although each panel looks different, then we planted the aerated concrete with vegetation, local vegetation. So that's a net zero facade. So that was the achievement there. It's a very low cost solution as well. And so the client was very pleased with it. And then what we tend to do for our data center clients is we try to give their projects, as a repeat client, we try to give our projects certain signature style for that client. And so that client had a signature style.
Okay, that's great. Love that. So you have also introduced what you call the hybrid data center, a model that's revolutionizing sustainable energy through what you call industrial symbiosis. So can you tell us more about this hybrid version and what benefits it offers in terms of energy use, again, environmental impacts, and perhaps also how we think about the role of infrastructure, because I think it really challenges the way we look at architecture.
Yeah. So that's the Helsinki hybrid, which has generated a lot of interest around the world on that project. What's fascinating is when you think about carbon intensity, I tend to think of it from end of life use rather than the beginning. So, for example, when that data center is finally disassembled, we can use the motherboards for other things. It has a carbon fiber structure to it that can be disassembled and reused. And what was really unique about that project, it was a combination of traditional data racks and immersion cooling racks. So the immersion cooling, of course, is you put the rack into a liquid bath and it cools the racks. Now that project was wrapped with a robotic vertical farm. And so that concealed. Now, in the basement of that is our anaerobic digesters. So the waste from the vertical farm goes through the anaerobic digester, which itself produces electricity. So that was an achievement there. And then we located that data center near the city center of Helsinki, and so what it looked like actually started to matter because it became a civic building. Now, in Helsinki, in the winter, they fly in their produce from the Netherlands. And so a tomato costs €1. for example. So the produce from the vertical farm was sold at the marketplace down below, and during the winter, that was a big achievement there. And then it was sited on a park that we designed as well. And so we presented it. I presented that project in Bangkok. I presented it in Zagreb. I presented it around the world, and it's the first net zero data center.
It
We
is so
believe in.
brilliant, really, really brilliant. And I can only encourage people to go to your website and discover it. We will link it in the podcast notes. So we are going to cover others of your projects that are as interesting. I would also like to talk about a net zero community development you are working on in Hudson Valley in New York, where you are. So you've described it as a scalable climate cluster. So can you take us into this project? What makes it groundbreaking, and what lessons does it offer for how we might reimagine the future of sustainable living at scale?
Yes. So that's a very interesting project, and it's one that I'm managing because I'm so close to it. It's up near New Paltz, upstate New York, and again, we use the carbon triangle to choose our materials. It's a 53 unit housing, so it's not single family homes, it's collective housing, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom housing. And it's close to SUNY New Paltz, which is the university up there. And it's very interesting. The community itself is a very enlightened community of millennials there. So we use the carbon triangle to choose the materials. So black soji wood on the exterior, which has 100-year lifetime warranty. It's charred wood, cross-laminated timber rafters, Tesla solar shingles. It on the interiors as cork flooring, used bar. We also partnered with a PhD student out of the University of British Columbia, has developed a solar tower, which is very interesting. They touch down very lightly on the ground. They're a bifacial solar stackable tower that just simply fit in very well with the landscape and the trees there. And then we introduce a microgrid, which is something we haven't talked about. But microgrids are becoming more in these days, as we are finding that the U.S. has such a fractured electrical grid. The microgrids are the kind of answer to that, where they supply power for the local community or that development, but then they also plug into the grid. And so that project, actually, we're giving back to the grid because of all the solar involved. We also put the parking on the perimeter of that, so it's really a walking community. And so put all that combined on a beautiful 114-acre parcel of land with a trout stream, and it's a very, very, very nice project.
Yeah, yeah, it looks really beautiful. So we are going to tap further into your project. To follow up on this, Joe, one of your most forward-thinking projects is a smart city and campus model in California that challenges the idea that tech alone can fix urban problems. Instead, it blends dense, walkable design with nature, clean energy, and circular systems, all wrapped in what you call a neighborhood as a product. So you need to explain this. So can you take us inside that vision and how it's redefining what smart, sustainable urban living can actually look like?
Yes, that's an interesting project because it's on the outskirts of San Francisco. So it takes an existing American problem, a huge American problem, and that is the suburb. So you have to you drive into San Francisco for work, and then you drive back home. And luckily, San Francisco has a very extensive BART subway system, which works very, very well. But in this case, we took a derelict suburb and we've revitalized it by having a main street with with a tram running up and down the main street. And so that's where we got the neighborhood as a product idea from, that it was self-sufficient in that as far as waste, it was self-sufficient. As far as farming, it is self-sufficient. Then as far as the living, it's mixed use. So there's shopping and living combined as well as office space. But I think it's important to note that although we hear this term a lot, circularity, there really has never been 100% circularity city ever accomplished. And so that was kind of our challenge, was we were thinking, okay, well, what are all the principles that are required for 100% circularity? And the only way, this is from more of a developer's perspective. The only way that that actually would is if it was a rental model rather than like a condominium model, for example. And why is that? That would be because the developer would have to maintain all of these systems, recycling, for example, that kind of thing, waste, trash pickup. So that was the model there. It's successful. It's quite successful.
Yeah, that's fascinating again. So let's talk about the last one of your projects, and let's head to your eco-resort in Mykonos, because we all love Greece. I certainly do. So with this project, you're reimagining what luxury means in the age of climate change. I think you call the project the Zephyros Cliffside Sanctuaries. So it aims to become one of the first triple net zero resorts in the EU. So can you walk us through what triple net zero really means in practice?
Yes, I can. So the Mykonos, as an island, has very strict rules about what can be built on the island, of course, because of its natural beauty. So, for example, we can't use solar and we can't use wind. And of course, Mykonos would be a perfect place to put a solar array to power this eco resort, but they won't allow it because it's unattractive. So we were like, okay, well, how do we get this project to triple net zero, which is probably one of the hardest things to ever achieve, right? So what we did was there are three ways. So it requires 100% zero waste, zero water. So we collect rainwater, and that is the fresh water. And then we recycle the gray water and turn that into fresh water. We also recycle the black water and turn that into for vegetation for the local landscape. Now, again, this project has anaerobic digesters on it, so that will take the food scraps from the villa, from the eco resort, put them through an anaerobic digester, which produces enough electricity to power the entire eco resort. Then the third is zero GHG emissions. And so in order to do that, that means that the building materials themselves have to emit no emissions. So what we're using it's called the cliffside sanctuaries, because we're off the side of the cliff. We have hoisted CNC.
Yeah, again, it's really beautiful. And thank you for taking us through these examples, because you do paint them very vividly. And you and your team at Urban A&O have so many other fascinating projects, from built work to also I've discovered really nice visionary student concepts on your website. I really loved those exploring rising sea levels, because we know it's a big climate risk today.
Yeah.
So for anyone listening today, I would encourage you to explore more on Joe's website at urbanao.com. Joe, Now that we've been into the details, if we zoom out for a moment and think about what architecture as a discipline can truly contribute to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and today's most pressing climate challenges, what would you most like to highlight as a summary?
Well, it's interesting. Of course, there are 17 SDGs, and the deadline for the SDGs are 2030, which is just not very far off. And so it's interesting when we write our contracts for our clients, we write them according to which SDGs we are addressing with that project. And so that's critical for us, is that we try to hit at least 8 or 9 of them with every project. So and of course, what really drives the firm in general, along with the SDGs, is climate change. Our ability, because we know that in the built environment as architects, that we not only have the ability to mitigate, if not reverse climate change, then we encourage all of our colleagues to do the same as well.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, that's good to know you include the SDGs in your contracts. So I think you are someone well-traveled, and from what I've understood, your team is based across different parts of the world. So how does local culture, whether it's materials, climate, or community traditions, or perhaps even your own team, influence the way you approach design and architecture in different regions?
It's interesting. Everybody on the team, they bring with them a different cultural perspective, and that is very valuable to us. So someone in Manila versus someone in Athens versus someone in Vienna, versus me in New York, we all have a shared ethos about what we're doing collectively, but at the same time, we all live in our own cultural environments, and what that does is it brings multiple perspectives to the table when we're talking about projects. And if the team was just solely based in New York City, we would all be New Yorkers and we would all have that lived, shared experience. But we're not. And I think that's what makes the firm special. So really what makes the firm special are the people.
Wonderful. All right, last question before the very last one. Looking at the world today with all its challenges and opportunities, are there any particular regions that excite you the most? Places where you see huge potential for innovation, perhaps, or where you would personally love to be more involved?
That's a great question. I think that architects also have an obligation. This is where I think my career has always been associated with academia, and I think that the idea of, I won't say there should be a philanthropic component to every architect's life, I think. And what would that be? That would be doing a project pro bono, for example, because you believe in the cause. But in addition to that, I think passing on knowledge to younger generations, whether that be in the office or in the studio at university, I think that is also something that we can do, and I think it has a great impact on young people.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. I do think it's true for everybody, any profession. So, Joe, a last question before we finish, because it is the end of the podcast. And it is called Shades of Life, with the idea that each of us holds the power to paint life with our own colors, to leave a meaningful imprint on the planet. So I always end the podcast with the same question for each guest, and for you today. If you were a color, what would it be and why? And it can be anything you want and for any reason you want.
That's a great question. I will tell you, there's a funny story that goes with this. There's a famous architectural theorist, and she gave a lecture on, I guess it was a tongue-in-cheek lecture, but it left an everlasting imprint on my mind. Architects, for some reason, love cyan blue. And I have wondered, and of course I do too. And so I wondered, why is that? Why do we love cyan blue? And I believe that it's because it's a very complex color. When you think about the RGB, however they make colors, it's somewhere between green, turquoise, and blue, and so it's complex enough, and yet at the same time it's also very calming. I find it very kind of aspirational. That's my favorite color.
Right. Beautiful. I love it. There is actually a lot of history to it in Europe where I am.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I
It's
forgot about
fascinating.
that. Painters.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe, thank you so much for this truly insightful conversation. It was an absolute pleasure to have you today. You have helped us see just how much possibility lies within architecture, not just as buildings, but as systems that can reshape how we live, work, and care for the planet. We've talked about data centers, smart cities, eco-resorts, circular neighborhoods, and your work is really showing us what a regenerative future could actually look like and feel like, because we talked about experience as well. So it's inspiring to know that design, when rooted in both science and imagination, can be such a powerful force for change. So really thank you again for today.
Thank
Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to leave us with, a thought, a hope, or a message for those reimagining the future of our built world?
No, I would say that when we just landed on regenerative future, I think that is where the world is headed in so many different ways. And I'm glad that you closed on that word. And thank you so much, Ingrid, for the conversation. I really loved it. It was really great. Thank you for all your great questions.
Thank you, pleasure. And thank you to everyone for watching and listening today.